Norman sent a message. Diana, Norman sent a message. Edith didn't sleep well, so Edith? Oh. All right. Diane? Message from Norman. Edith didn't sleep well, so she's sleeping now. Thanks for your concern. What's that? Edith didn't sleep well, so she's sleeping now.
So, were you honored?
Oh, good, he's a Sunday. He was a Sunday. Right. Yeah.
You're like a walking punt.
You think so? Joe? How you doing? We were up in D.C. and we saw. Oh, we've been around. We went to the Supreme Court. Yeah.
And then we're going on a break for
Oh, okay.
and then we're coming back.
Because I'm going to be away. You're going to be away too.
We're working with this week.
Oh, wow.
It's a repeat of what we had in Truma and Tetzaveh before Kitisa. Then we had Kitisa and the sin of the golden calf. And now we're returning to review what happened before the golden calf. Because after the golden calf, there's a question of, well, how's this going to work? You know, we really, if you read through the prophets, this was an adulterous affair. Right? That's what the golden calf was and it's related to later in the Torah when we meet the sota, the suspected adulteress. The suspected adulteress is punished in the same way that the builders of the golden calf were. And so now that you've had this adulterous affair, meaning that the Israelites, worshipped an idol, well, how are they going to come back now to God? And also, what's the role of Moses? Now, when we build the tabernacle, there are two people who are involved, specifically. Remember them? One of them has an art school in Rechavia, Bezalel, and his partner, Oholiab, not as easy to say. Now, so there are really, let's say, four people who are involved. Bezalel, who starts building it, Oholiab, who works with him, Moses, who's the director of everything, and the guy who's going to use it first, Aaron, who's the priest. So four people. There's one other guy who's involved with the golden calf, with Aaron, but it's only mentioned midrashically, but it's interesting. And when Aaron says, where is he hinted at in the Torah? When Aaron says to when Moses comes down the mountain, he says to Aaron, how could you do this? He said, they would have killed me. What are you talking about? Well, they already killed the first guy who tried to stop them, who was a guy named Hur. H-U-R, pronounced? Hur. Yeah, his son was Ben-Hur, right. Not going to get that in Boca. So, who's Hur? Hur is an important character. Hur is the son of Miriam. Good. And Miriam is married to, again, this is only midrashic, so I understand if you don't know from the Torah, but according to the tradition, Miriam is married to Caleb. So Miriam, who is the sister of Moses and Aaron, is born into which tribe? It's got to be the same one as Moses and Aaron. Levi. So Miriam's a Levite. However, when a woman gets married, she takes on the tribe of her husband. And if Miriam marries Caleb, very good. She goes into now the tribe of Judah. So let's say it this way. The people who are involved of building with the idea of needing this tabernacle, Hur from Judah, Moses and Aaron from Levi, Bezalel also from Judah, and Oholiab from Dan. Okay? That's what we have so far. Now, who else is generally considered the leader of the Jewish people besides the tribe of Judah? I'll give you a hint. He plays a large role in Genesis with his brothers who throw him into slavery, and he becomes in charge. Oh, wow, Joseph, yeah. Joseph. So if we think of the leaders of the Jewish people who have stepped up now, you're looking at basically Judah, Levi, and Joseph. Now, Joseph, though, gets split into two tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. So if I say, well, this guy's from Ephraim or this guy's from Manasseh, that means Joseph. Okay. Now, why do I tell you all this? Because as we go into Pekudei, it becomes interesting to see how the tribal affiliations are at play, right? When you rise up through the ranks and then you take on national significance, you still remember, what state the person's from, or you still remember what tribe they're from. And so it becomes very important for a particular tribe. So, for example, one of the things we say that's so wonderful about the Levites is that they didn't worship the golden calf. Well, yeah, they had a particular loyalty to their guy. Moses was from their tribe. Right? Now, does that mean, were they just more spiritual, and so they didn't worship the golden calf? Or were they really just hoping that their guy would come back? I don't know. And the audio is hard, that we have is hard to make out. It's hard. You can hear a little bit what they're saying, but it's like a little garbled. You can't really tell what they're saying. Okay, so that's the introduction to these characters we're about to meet again, Bezalel and Aholiab. Judy, Norman, we're einsprachlich. So thank God they're okay, but we need you. We're not just bringing you in off the bullpen today. You're starting. Okay, so let's take a look. Exodus chapter 38, verse 21, which is the beginning of Pekudei. Now, usually we try to do the middle of the portion because we're in the second triennial cycle. However, this really is the second triennial cycle if you're reading both portions together. So we don't cover this part very often. So chapter 38, verse 21, the very beginning of the Torah portion called Pekudei, which is the last portion in the book of Exodus. Okay, here we go.
These are the records of the tabernacle of the pact, which were drawn up at Moses' bidding, the work of the Levites under the direction of Ithamar, son of Aaron, the priest. Now Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, made all that the Lord had commanded Moses. At his side was Oholiab, son of, oh my goodness, help me with this one. Ahisamach of the tribe of Dan, carver and designer, an embroiderer in blue, purple, and crimson yarns, and in fine linen. All the gold that was used for the work and all the work of the sanctuary, the wave offering of gold, came to 29 talents and 730 shekels by the sanctuary weight.
Okay, so can we go back just to verse 21 for a second? Try to understand what just happened in verse 21. So, Pekudei, which is the name of the Torah portion, lifkod, in biblical Hebrew, means to count. These are the accountings of. This is the number of whatever you happen to be counting. A pakid in modern Hebrew is a clerk, someone who counts. Okay. Ele Pekudei Hamishkan. These are the accountings of the tabernacle. And then if we skip the next two words, Mishkan ha'edut, let's just skip those for a second. So if I skip those two words and said, Ele Pekudei Mishkan, these are the accountings of the tabernacle, Asher Pakad al pi Moshe, that Moses counted, Avodat Leviim, the work of the Levites, by the hand of Itamar, the son of Aaron the Kohen. Right, so, okay, fine. So these are they counted up the stuff that they made. But then there are these two words that I'm not sure I understand. Mishkan ha'edut. These are the accountings of the Mishkan. I'm not sure how you translate it. These are the accountings of the Mishkan of the testimony. Is that how do you translate it? Pact of the testimony? Or the Mishkan of the pact? Wait,
Is that to suggest that there was more than one tabernacle?
no.
Because specifying the
Yeah. Yeah, so hang on a second. What is your translation? How does your translation say it?
tabernacle of the pact.
Oh, the tabernacle of the pact. Now, that sounds like you're driving through Utah, looking at names of churches. I mean, the tabernacle, what does that even mean? Does anyone even know what that means? The tabernacle of the pact.
God's forgiveness. God's forgiveness. God's forgiveness.
What do you mean?
Well, V'shochanti b'toham, God was going to reside there, and by residing there, He will always be with the Jewish people and forgive them for the sin of the golden calf.
Okay. You looked ahead.
Maybe.
Every week you do. Okay, you're on the right track. Well, you're on exactly. Okay. So I didn't bring it. I didn't bring the Rashi on this verse, but here's what Rashi says: Mishkan Ha'edut, the Mishkan of the testimony, or the tabernacle of the testimony or pact, is a testimony for Israel that God overlooked the incident of the golden calf for them, for he rested his Shekhinah among them. Okay, so the idea here is what we're saying is, these are the accountings of the Mishkan of the testimony. And by saying the Mishkan of the testimony, what we're really saying is, well, actually, I brought the Midrash on it. That's how you know this. You read my Midrash. Okay. So if you read the third source on the sheet, it says Exodus Rabbah 51:4. Ken, would you mind reading that? What is the test? So when it says, what is the testimony, I'm trying to figure out what is this word edut, which we either translated as pact or testimony. What is this? Okay.
What is the testimony? Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yishmael said, "It is testimony for all who enter the world that there is forgiveness for Israel. Alternatively, it is testimony for the entire world that Moses was appointed by the Holy One, blessed be he. So too the Holy One, blessed be he, loved Israel and brought them before Mount Sinai. He gave them the Torah and called them a kingdom of priests, as it is stated, 'You will be for me a kingdom of priests,' Exodus 19:6. 40 days later, they sinned. At that moment, the idolaters said, 'He will never again be reconciled with them,' as it is stated, they said among the nations, 'They will not reside here anymore,' Lamentations 4:15. When Moses went to ask for mercy for them, the Holy One, blessed be he, immediately forgave them. As it is stated, the Lord said, 'I have forgiven in accordance with your statement,' Numbers 14:20. Moses said, 'Master of the universe, I am satisfied that you have pardoned Israel, but proclaim before the eyes of all the nations that there is no residual resentment in your heart against them.' The Holy One, blessed be he, said to him, 'As you live, I will rest my divine presence in their midst. As it is stated, they shall craft a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them,' Exodus 25:8. And they will recognize that I have pardoned them. That is the tabernacle of testimony, as it is testimony for Israel that the Holy One, blessed be he, has pardoned them."
Okay. So there's a lot going on there. So based on that reading, what is this phrase? Tabernacle of the pact. Richard?
It's a physical manifestation and a touchstone for human beings to acknowledge the fact that God has indeed forgiven them of the sin of the golden calf.
Exactly. Exactly. And you see that Lamentations is quoted here. Now, Lamentations is what we read on Tisha B'Av that reminds us of the destruction of the first temple. Echa, right. So, the Lamentations written by Jeremiah. Jeremiah was one of the exiles into Babylonia. So when he's writing this, what does he have to say? Judaism isn't over. We're going back. And we'll have sovereignty again. But the only way that we can go back and have sovereignty again and rebuild the temple is if we still have this relationship with God. Which, in my mind, is why it makes no sense to be a Zionist if you don't believe in God. Because what's the point? Why go to Uganda? Until you realize that they don't want you in Uganda either. Did you know that part of the story? They actually voted for Uganda. Uganda, when Herzl in 1903 brought Uganda, they won. It won. Then half the people who voted against walked out and said, forget it. And they said, all right, come on back. Well, we won't go to Uganda. But by the time they wanted to go to Uganda, the nations of Africa said, oh, by the way, we don't want you here either. So, okay, that's a different lecture. But from Jeremiah's point of view, the relationship still endures, even though we were kicked out and the temple was destroyed. But where does Jeremiah get that idea? Well, we've seen this before. 40 days after, Moses came down from the mountain, now you see the Jewish people turned on God. And at that moment, God could have wiped them out. And Moses reminded God, you made this deal. It's eternal. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah? That was forever, this relationship. Other nations don't have that get-out-of-jail-free card. The other nations lose it, and then you lost it. But we have that eternal promise.
That's why when we and the person of Adam were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, then God restrained himself.
Very nice. Exactly. And this is going to, in a lot of, I'm actually going to speak, there's a connection there, but I'm saving that for the conservative minion. So, because I used to repeat the same thing. But then I noticed there are like 3 people who go to the conservative minion who also come to this.
Spies.
Right. Well, I didn't want to give them the same thing twice, so now I have to do 2 different things. So, but so I'm saving that for later, so I can't give you that now. But call me after the conservative minion if you don't come, and I'll tell you. Okay, so what we've established so far are these 2 bizarre words that come at the beginning of chapter 28, in verse 21. In Hebrew, Mishkan Ha'edut, the tabernacle of the pact, which seem to indicate that there was a forgiveness. And the reason that there's a forgiveness is because what God says is, when you now construct this tabernacle, remember, Vasuli Mikdash v'shachanti betocham, build this sanctuary, this was Exodus 25, that I may dwell among you. So if you build it, then I have to show up. But I can't show up and dwell among you if I'm not with you. And I might not be with you because you built the golden calf. Comes this verse and says, I'm coming back. That's a big deal. Right. All right. Kevin Costner over here. All right. So now the next thing we mentioned is verse 22. Now, remember I mentioned, this is going to be very interesting. So there's Miriam, who's married to Caleb. They have a son named Hor. Remember Hor? Look at verse 22. But Salel is the son of Uri. We almost never get the name of the grandfather too. Usually you say so-and-so, the son of so-and-so. Unless there's a particular reason to let us know who the grandfather is. And so that's what we have here. But Salel, the son of Uri, the son of Hor, Hor is now dead. He's the guy who died defending the Jews, trying not to get them to build defending Moses, trying to get them not to build a golden calf. Now, why was Hor maybe so invested in protecting Moses? Because it was his uncle. His mother was Miriam. So now what we just saw is that Bezalel is the grandson of Miriam. He's 12 years old when he gets the job. According to the Talmud, but he's a young guy. If you do the math according to the Torah, he can't be that old. He's Miriam's grandson. He's only 12. Sorry, great-grandson. Now remember, Moses is 80 at the time, and Miriam's older than him. Miriam's older than Moses, so it's not so far-fetched. Right? But Bezalel's a very young guy. He is a prodigy, I guess. Okay. So the names are interesting here. And the fact that the Torah tells you who the grandson is means it wants you to know that, because it's interesting. And maybe because they're from the tribe of Judah. Now, the name Bezalel may or may not be his name. Maybe it was prophetic that they gave him this name. But what is sel? Shadow. B is in. Sel is shadow, and El is God. So his name means in the shadow of God. Which, okay, well, he's the guy who's going to be standing in the place where the Shekhinah comes. So it's a nice name. Oholiab, nobody knows what that means. Actually, we do. You know what an ohel is? An ohel is a tent, and Av is the father. So the tent of the father, it's a similar term, right? Shadow, tent, God, father, similar names. You don't see a lot of Israeli boys, with the name Oholiab. But Salel, you do. Okay. Now, then it says, verse 23, with him was Oholiab. Now, we already know this. This is just a repetition. We already met these characters. With him was Oholiab, son of Achisamach. So you might ask, well, why don't you tell us who his grandfather is? Because it doesn't matter. Chur, we needed to know. Oholiab's grandfather doesn't matter. But what we do need to know is what tribe he's from. And so now it says the tribe of Dan. Now, I heard a comparison this week. If you think about, there are four mothers of the Jewish people, right? Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. Which means that from the women, there are four firstborn. Right? Four women, they each have one son that's born first. Leah is the first one to get pregnant, and the first tribe is Reuben. So Reuben's a firstborn. Rachel finally gets pregnant, and her first son is Joseph. Now it gets a little harder. Who was Zilpah's first son? You know Bilhah and Zilpah, the two? Oh, by the way, I said Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. I didn't mean that. I meant Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah, the four wives of Jacob who give birth to the tribes of Israel. So amongst the tribes, there are four firstborn from four different women. That's what I meant to say. So Rachel and Leah, I told you, are Joseph and Reuben. Well, you knew that, Joseph and Reuben. Bilhah and Zilpah, not as easy. Who's the firstborn of Zilpah is Gad. And the firstborn of Bilhah is Dan. Okay? Dan. By the way, we have Dan here. Interesting. Right? So now we told you the four firstborn are Reuben, Gad, Yosef, and Dan. Now, Joseph gets split into Ephraim and Manasseh. So let me say it this way. Reuben, Manasseh, Gad, and Dan. Okay, you might say, who cares? But listen closely. Does anything come to mind when you hear these three names? Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. What do those three tribes have in common? Remember 2.5 tribes said we want to stay behind on the other side of the Jordan River? Who was it? Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. Okay, so it's interesting. But then you have Dan. Well, who's Dan? Dan's the other one. Where does Dan settle? Right on the opposite border of those three. The four firstborn settled together. They're right across the border. Dan's across the border in the land of Israel. But if you ever cross the Jordan River, it's not exactly the Mississippi. I mean, you could jump over it. There's certain spots where you could actually just jump over it. We go there and tell people we're going to whitewater raft down the Jordan River. I mean, my pool is sometimes rockier, than the Jordan River. The Jordan River is like a very serene, skinny, narrow river. No, it's not deep at all. If you've ever been to Far Bloom and you did the kayaking down the Jordan River, it's beautiful, but it's not large. So you had Reuben tribe and Manasseh on one side, and right across you have Dan. So the four of them settled together. There are also the four tribes that were involved in the Battle of Amalek, if we would get into that, and they're the four tribes that are involved here with putting up the Mishkan. Okay, so there's something about the firstborn of these four tribes that stick together. Now, the problem is, what is the relation? Why Dan? So when we go to build the Mishkan, you'd think the two tribes that would be most important would be Judah and Joseph, right? And when Israel split into two, the south is called Judah and it's run by Judah. The north is called Israel and it's run by Joseph. The biggest tribe in the north is Ephraim. So really, and the Messiah is supposed to be from Judah and then from Joseph. Judah and Joseph are the two main characters. But when we go to build the Mishkan, we have Judah and Dan, not Joseph. So my question is Dan a proxy for Joseph? Does Dan represent Joseph? So why would anyone think that? Look at the top of the sheet, back to Genesis. Annabelle, would you mind reading that? This is Genesis 30, verses 1 through 6. In the past, I said, let's all flip to like page 82 of Plowed or something. But the looks I get are annoying. So I just put it on the sheet. These are the verses. This is not an esoteric source. This is actual Torah from the sheet. Okay, 31 to 6.
When Rachel saw that she had borne Jacob no children, she became envious of her sister. And Rachel said to Jacob, "Give me children, or I shall die." Jacob was incensed at Rachel and said, "Can I take the place of God, who has denied you the fruit of the womb?" She said, "Here is my maid Bilhah. Consort with her, that she may bear on my knees, and that through her I too may have children." So she gave him her maid Bilhah as concubine, and Jacob cohabited with her. Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son.
Okay, so what happened? Rachel's frustrated she can't get pregnant. And she blames Jacob. And Jacob says, "What do you want from me? I'm doing, this is God's decision." So she said, "All right, well, listen, if I'm not going to have a child by you, at least have a handmaid. My handmaid, Bilhah, will have a child by you, but that child will be for me because I can't actually have one. So my handmaid will have one, but since she's my handmaid, it'll be like he's my son, and that'll be my guy." So, okay, that's what happens in verse 5. Now, guess who it's going to be? Look at verse 6.
And Rachel said, "God has vindicated me. Indeed, God has heeded my plea and given me a son." Therefore, she named him Dan.
Dan, because Dan means to judge, like God judged me favorably and gave me this son. You see that Dan just became a proxy for Joseph. Cool, right? Dan in Hebrew, Dan in English. Good question. And Dan actually ends up getting different sections of Israel. He gets two different holdings. And you could ask, is it because he's a firstborn? And remember, the firstborn gets a double portion. So if you've ever been to Tel Aviv, yeah, well, the area is called Gush Dan. That whole area, the Dan Gush means block, the Dan block. And whenever there are missile warnings or rocket warnings in that area, you'd see on TV there's a rocket warning for Gush Dan, which means Tel Aviv, Rishon LeZion, that area, Cholon, the coastal area, central coastal area. So they also get this spot in the north, closer to the Jordan River. But one of the things you see in Israel is that the bus line is called Eged, but not in Tel Aviv. In Tel Aviv, it's called Dan. It's like a different company. And the reason it's called Dan is because that land was the holding of Dan, which is kind of interesting. If you look at now, Rashi has a line about Dan from Deuteronomy, which says, Dan is a lion's cub. Now, normally the lion we think of as Judah, right? And Jerusalem has the image of a lion because Judah its base was in Jerusalem. But Dan also is called Gur Aryeh, right? A lion. And according to Rashi, on the page there, he too lived close to the border and therefore compares him to a lion. Right? Because they lived right on the border by Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, who lived just across the border. And if you were on the border, you had to be ready to fight. You're the first line of defense. And so they were warrior type. Right. Okay. And that was really their connection to Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, because remember what Moses said to Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh? They said, if you want to stay on the east bank of the Jordan River, you can, but not until you come fight and defend the land first. And then if you do that, you can go back. So these were warriors. And that's who Dan was as well. Okay. So that's just interesting. But now, so let's ask this question. When you're building the Mishkan, if you wanted the tribes who were in leadership, you should go with Judah and Joseph. But let's say you don't want to go with Joseph for any particular reason. You needed to replace him. Well, who's a natural replacement for Joseph? Looking back at what we looked at Genesis, you'd say Dan. And why does Dan fit the bill perfectly? Because Judah was the strongest tribe, and Dan was the weakest tribe. And if you wanted to say that everyone had a fair chance in building that the tabernacle represented all the Jews.
Thank you.
If you wanted to say that the tabernacle represented all of the Jews, you don't just take the two largest tribes or the two most powerful tribes, you take one of the weakest. So if you take Dan, you're saying, yes, Dan is the weakest. What about Joseph? Well, he sort of represents Joseph too, so it fits. But there's something even more interesting about it, which is when the Jews left Egypt, who was in the leadership as they were marching? Judah. Remember the first guy who jumped into the water was Nachshon? He's from Judah. Judah was in front. Dan was in the way back. So now we're really getting the extremities of the Jewish people that represent everybody. And that's why Oholiab is important. Because now, here's the other thing that's important. Where does Amalek attack? Rear. From the rear. Now, one of the reasons, sometimes people say, if you're like a Tikkun Olam rabbi, right? They'll say, well, the old and the weak were in the rear. And the people, this is what happens when you don't protect the old and the weak, is that they get attacked. Okay. The other tribes didn't have any old and weak. Was Dan the only tribe that had old and weak? All the tribes had old and weak. Dan was in the back, according to the Midrash. Now, this is if you're like a religious rabbi, like one of these weird, like weird rabbis. I'm talking about Reform, but like one of these strange rabbis, that believes in the Torah. Like I just came from a rabbinic conference, so like, oh, you like Israel? Okay. All right. You have to be there. So, according to Midrash, Dan was in the back because they were the weakest, and they actually brought idols with them out of Egypt. And the reason that they were attacked was because they were the weakest, and that's what Amalek does. Amalek attacks the weakest of who you are. Now, what the rest of the tribes could have said is, that's what you get. You're worshiping idols. You're carrying around. They had an idol. His name was Micha. They were carrying around this idol, and they were, weak. And the rest of the tribes could have said, that's what you get. But that's not what happened. The rest of the Israelite tribes went to war to protect them, and they defeated Amalek and then moved on. Remember, Moses had his hands up, and they ended up winning the war. Okay. So now you go to build the Mishkan, and who do you have? You have the tribe that's leading the way, that believes in God, that jumps into the water first, that believes in God no matter what. And you had the tribe who was the weakest in faith and was still worshiping idols even as they were walking out of Egypt. It's an interesting combination. So why would that be the combination? Based on what we learned over the last couple of weeks, why would that be an interesting combination for the Mishkan? Well, what's the point of the Mishkan?
Represent everybody.
Yes. But what do we learn about Edut HaMishkan? What does that mean? You are forgiven. Well, if everyone who goes in front of it isn't guilty of anything, what good is it? It's for the guilty. And bringing Dan in now represents the guilty. Clear so far? Okay. So there's one more piece of this. If we go back to verse 21, you really only need a couple verses today. Or what did I want to show you actually? Where's that verse that I like? Okay, sorry. If you just skip with me to the beginning of chapter 40. Chapter 40, verse 1 and 2. Okay, so Joe, would you mind reading verse 1 and 2?
And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, On the first day of the first month, you shall set up the tabernacle of the tent of meeting, the place where the ark of the pact and the screen of the ark with the curtain. Bring in the table and lay out its due setting. Bring in the lampstand and light its lamps.
Okay, good enough. So, yeah, the translation is lampstand. It's like nobody knows what that is. But you know what people know what it's a menorah. In Hebrew, you know it. In English, it's like, what is that? By the way, I was at a meeting. It was really interesting. During the conference, there was a meeting of about 10 rabbis who were invited to meet with the editors of the new Plow. It's not going to be called Plow, but the new edition, the new commentary of the Reform movement. And in this conversation, decisions were made about what this is going to look like this, or we're going to do this, and we're going to do this. And I was sitting around with a few other rabbis, and we're like, wow, we're making history here. This is really great. So, when you get to like page 1422, and you can see a comma, that's me. That's me. Yeah. So that's going to be my contribution to the movement. No, but we had like ideas, and we said, do this. And they wrote it down. I said, okay, we're going to do that. Like, wow. It was really cool. It was really cool. You know why they invited me? Because they want your money. That's why. So, not for my grammatical. Okay. If you read my book, you know it's not for my grammar. All right. So now there's a date here in verse 2. On the day of the first month, on the first of the month, you shall erect the Mishkan. By the way, the 8th month, I was wrong, John, I told you last time, it was actually Cheshvan. And the reason they picked Cheshvan, Jeroboam, was because there's no holiday in that month. So that's why we call it sometimes, after Tishrei, you have a month called Cheshvan. It's often called Mar Cheshvan. Mar means bitter, like Marur, because it's the only holiday, it's the only month with no celebration of anything. And so Jeroboam said, there's no holiday for this month, I'll put my holiday here. So sometimes I get the months confused. But the first month I can remember. Biblically, it's not Tishrei. Rabbinically, it's Tishrei. But biblically, the first month is Nisan. So look what just happened here. Verse 40 is very interesting. God says to, verse 1 of chapter 40. God said to Moses, saying, on the day of the first month, on the first of the month, meaning the first of the month of Nisan. Well, this is a year later. Well, what happened a year ago on this day? Almost.
Well, no, they were supposed to leave on the 14th.
They did, yeah.
Right, that's the 14th.
So God tells them, the plagues end, or are about to end, and God tells them, prepare yourself to leave. And then they leave on the 14th. That's why we have Passover in the middle of the month of Nisan, which is coming up. But God tells them to prepare yourself to leave on the first of the month. So you have these two first of the months. So 1 year ago today, from chapter 40, we were told to prepare to leave. Now we're being told, finish erecting the Mishkan. What do we have here? The beginning and the ending of salvation. This, the beginning was prepare to leave Egypt. The ending is build the Mishkan, and I will now dwell with you. That's salvation. What's salvation? God dwells with you. But you don't get that until you've finished the Mishkan. And when will that happen? On the 1-year anniversary of when you left, of when I told you to leave. So it's a 1-year period of the beginning and the ending of salvation. Okay? What you might call in Hebrew, Geula. Okay? Clear so far? Which, by the way, is that's the second part of the Amidah. Right? The vote, and then you get to the Geula. Okay, so why is that interesting? A couple of commentaries to conclude, and then hopefully make a point. Now, by the way, Bezalel and Aholiab built this thing. We can agree on that, right? But look what happens in verse 2. On the first day of the month, so we know from verse 1, God's talking to Moses. On the first day of the month, now in Hebrew, in English, you could mean singular or plural. But in Hebrew, it can't because it's conjugated differently. Right? So if I was going to, the word to erect or to, to erect is lahakim. Now, if I would say plural, you erected plural, it would be takimu. But if I'm saying you singular erected, it would be takim. Which means that God is telling here Moses, you singular are going to do the erecting. So here's what it says. On the first day of the month, on the first month, you, Moses, will erect the Mishkan. Which means that you, Moses, will erect the Mishkan and not those other guys. Bezalel and Aholiab. Very interesting. All right. Okay, so keep that in mind. The Orach Chaim, 18th century Morocco, who, although he made his way to Israel at the end of his life, here's what he says. Someone, Shelley, would you mind reading the Orach Chaim on Exodus 38:21?
The use of the word Elohai may reflect yet another consideration. Seeing that Moses alone had made the count of the materials contributed for the tabernacle, the Torah testifies that his count was indeed accurate. The Torah goes out of its way by stating it accepted Moses' count by using the words Meshapi, Moshe Al?
Yeah, it's backwards. It's backwards. It should be Al Pi Moshe, which means
Al Pi Moshe.
according to what Moses said.
According to what Moses said, the reason the Torah did not write
Asher Pakad Moshe.
Asher Pakar Moshe was to demonstrate that Moses needed no witnesses to confirm the accuracy of his count.
Okay, so what just happened? All of the gold and silver that was used, and the way the portion starts, Ele Pekudei. These are the accountings of the Mishkan, meaning that someone was counting all of the gold and silver. It was Moses. But there's a halachic problem with that.
There has to be two people,
How'd you know that?
because it's part of our law, that you can't, no matter who they are, you have to have a second person to make sure that. Witnesses.
Yeah, I know that, but how did you know that? That's a...
Read in the.
Oh, come on! All right. Oh, you have the stone, no wonder. If you all had the stone, I wouldn't have to have these classes. But, no. The stone has a great commentary. All right. Halachically, there's a problem. You're not allowed to have one person count possessions of other people. Right? That's illegal. Why? Because you might steal it. Now, in this case, though, Moses did all of the counting on his own. And so the Orach Chaim comes and says, but the Torah would never allow that. We know from the Talmud that that's illegal, that you can't do that. Okay, so why? So then we must say, well, this must be a special case. Okay, so now we know the problem that the Orach Chaim's pointing out. Let's go on. Shelley? Where do we leave off? We encounter?
We encounter something of a similar nature in Leviticus 23:2, where God employs the word
Ela Moadei Hashem.
Elo Moshe Hashem, calling the dates fixed by the Sanhedrin for certain festivals to occur. My festivals. God does not double-check the calculations of the Sanhedrin. We live by the Torah Moses has handed down to us orally. It would have been an insult to send in auditors to check his calculations. The Torah has made it clear in 36:3 that Moses alone accepted all the donations.
Okay, so why is Moses different than the Sanhedrin was 120 different judges. And what the Sanhedrin said was, okay, no problem, there's 120 of them. And there was also like a supreme of the, there was the head of the Sanhedrin. So if the Sanhedrin says this is so-and-so, okay, fine. But you would never allow one person to do that. But with Moses, we do. And the reason why is because if you don't trust Moses, let's say it this way, not even that. I mean, it's true. If you don't trust Moses, who are you going to trust? But also, Moses is fallible. He makes mistakes. He could make a mistake. You might want to have someone, check up on his work. But if you don't trust Moses, Moses was the only one who was there when the Torah was given. He was the only one on Mount Sinai who wrote it down. He was the only one who heard the oral laws and passed them down. And if you don't trust him, there's no Judaism. Because what you're saying is, we don't know if the Torah is real or not. We don't know if the laws are real. It was only through this guy, and we don't trust this guy. So maybe I can eat a cheeseburger. Maybe you put that in as a joke. And Moses wasn't the funniest guy. He doesn't joke around a lot in the Torah. But if you don't trust Moses, who was the only link to God in the Mount Sinai, there's no Judaism. Interesting, right? All right, there's one more piece to it. We're building up to the final knockout punch. So now Rabbeinu Bachya, who's a little bit earlier than the Orach Chaim, has one more piece to this. John?
Betzalel, Oholiov, and all the artisans were endeavoring to erect the tabernacle, but were unable to do so. This is the meaning of the words in 33. They brought the tabernacle to Moses. The reason they brought it to Moses was their inability to erect it so that it would remain standing. Moses felt very badly about this, seeing he had not had a personal share in working on the tabernacle. God consoled him, telling him that no other human being would be able to put up the tabernacle, whereas as soon as Moses would begin to busy himself with erecting it, it would erect itself. This would teach the Jewish people that if Moses would be unable to erect the tabernacle, it would never become functional. God told him that he would record in the Torah that the tabernacle had been erected by Moses personally, unassisted. This is the meaning of the verse in which Moses is instructed to erect the tabernacle on the date mentioned. After hearing this, Moses said to God, "I do not know how to put it up." God answered him, "You begin to busy yourself with it, and seeing that you have been shown it where it stood, it will stand by itself, corresponding to the vision you have had."
Okay, so it was very interesting, meaning that originally, maybe, the tabernacle could have been erected by Betzalel and Aholiab. That's when we were in Truma and Tetzaveh. But then there was the golden calf. And the golden calf changed things. And now, in order for the tabernacle to be erected, it could only be done by Moses. And even Moses admits, I don't know how to do this. And God said, well, just start, and you'll see it'll naturally come to you. And, basically I'm going to help you and show you what to do, and you'll do it. And he did, and that was fine. But again, we still have this problem that, should this really be done by just one person? Can you trust it? Can you trust that it's being done the right way? And the fact that the Israelites do trust Moses is seen in the, God, if they didn't trust Moses, none of this would work. And he wouldn't be able to put it up. But something interesting happens. We just went through a moment where Moses was on Mount Sinai and they lost faith in Moses. So we were just at a place where you would think, how could you ever not trust Moses? Well, they just didn't. And so in order for this to work, in order for all of this to work, you have to reestablish trust between the Jewish people and Moses. And even though you could say, how could you not trust Moses? They didn't. And so in order to say, well, is this going to go on? So you look at a personal relationship, and you might say something like, if there's anyone in the world I'm going to trust, it's going to be my spouse. And then, you get betrayed. And you say, well, how is that possible? So then you say, okay, well, let's just get back together, no problem. Okay, but trust needs to be reestablished. And so what the Torah, I think, is doing here is showing us that in the same way that we have to learn to trust each other, we have that same relationship as the Jewish people with God. And there are moments where we question God. And if you think about it, especially, I'm reading now a biography of Alexander Schindler. It's very interesting. And you talk about, Alexander Schindler was the president of the Reform movement for many years, he grew up in Munich and during the Nazi period and lost a lot of family in the Holocaust. His daughter was my senior rabbi when I was in Charlotte, a very good friend of mine. But he talks about the creation of a whole new era of Jewish philosophy called after Auschwitz. Like, is there a God after Auschwitz? And it's very, think about that. So the Holocaust was a moment of questioning, was a moment of broken faith. A moment of broken faith. And I think, from a national sense, we as Israel have had these moments of broken faith. And we've always recovered, otherwise we wouldn't be here. But personally, individually, we also have these moments of broken faith. And what this story, I think, does is restores hope that even if your faith is broken, it can be renewed. And that's the idea, I think, of the 4 firstborn who come together to work on this and to establish the covenant. As even when Judah and Joseph are broken into 2, right, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Even when Judah's at the front of the line following God, but Dan's at the back of the line breaking up with God or worshiping idols. Even when the Levites are the only ones at Mount Sinai who are stuck with Moses and everyone else turns away from him. Even when you have these moments of broken faith, if we, the Jewish people, lost faith every time our faith was broken, we would have disintegrated millennia ago. And there are going to be these moments when our faith is tested. But what's interesting is, when Moses argues to God, you can't give up on this people because you made a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah, that they were an eternal people. It wasn't so much God's decision that we would be an eternal people. It was our decision that we would be an eternal people. And even in the moments when our faith has been broken, unlike other groups of people who have broken up over time because they lost faith with their land or their people or their God or whatever, and now they don't exist anymore, look at us, continuing to repair our faith, come back together, make up with one another, even now. after October 7th. If you watch what's going on in Israel, we have no external threats that can overcome us. The only threats are internal. The fighting with each other is what can tear us apart. And so in those moments when Dan's carrying an idol in the back and we're Judah leading the way in the front, we have to remember that even those Jews who might detest us, Judah still went to war to fight to defend Dan, even while Dan was carrying an idol in his pocket. And that's the ultimate message, that our faith, we can lose trust in each other, but we can't forget that we have to always come back together in the end. I think that's why we as the Jewish people are still here, although we give God a run for his money on a continual basis. All right, so as we enter the Pesach season, we need to take. I want to make one last announcement, and I hate to do this on Shabbat, but I'm raising money. So you may or may not know this, but we have a very special relationship, our Temple Beth Am Day School, with a sister school in Odessa, Ukraine, called the Tikva Children's Home. Tikva Children's Home is a home of about 1,000 Jewish orphans who are pretty much the most unfortunate Jews in the world. The chances that there could be a war, a prolonged war in the Ukraine and in Israel at the same time has totally devastated them. We've had this connection with them for about 10 years. And when the war started in Ukraine, they had to board these buses and flee to Moldova. About 1,000 kids on a bunch of different buses from preschool age to high school. They were on the bus for about 80 hours, not even knowing if they would be accepted into Moldova. They got into Moldova, eventually got kicked out of Moldova, and now they're in Romania. And there's this group of Jews who are traveling running from place to place, as Jewish people have in the past, and they're almost out of money. And these kids are literally starving. So these kids are literally starving. So we know them. Some of them have been here. So they're doing a campaign. I have a team. I started yesterday. I have until April 2nd. I'm trying to raise 36 grand. I've already raised 6 grand just last night. So if everyone contributes a little bit, we should be able to do it. $100, $200, whatever, would really help go a long way. These kids, their home in Ukraine has been bombed to hell. And so you have these Jewish orphans, they've lost their families. Whatever cousins or relatives they had who stayed back to fight are probably dead. And they really have nowhere to go. And unlike Israel, most of the people who support them over the years, their attention has been averted to Israel because of the war in Israel, which is great. But no one's funding them anymore. And in Israel, yeah. So in Israel, you have an Israeli. If you're an Israeli kid, you're being bombed too, but you have an Israeli army in a country to protect you. These kids, the only people that have to protect them is us. So if you go on my Facebook or my Instagram, there's a link. If you want, I can text it to you. Just send me a text and I'll text you the link. If you want to help, I would really appreciate it. I have till April 2nd. And I will say one last thing. We read many, many times in the Torah, but we don't often get the chance to do it. It's in the Torah over 12 times. To watch out for the orphan. These are them. This is our chance to do that mitzvah. So if you can help me, I'd really appreciate it. And if you see it online, or if you go on my Facebook or my Instagram, if you could share it also on your social media, then it would infinitely help the cause. So I hate to ask money on Shabbat, but this is the only time I'm going to see you between now and April 2nd. So please help me. And next week on Shabbat, I'll have a different cause that I'm so yeah. It may